If Ukraine does not survive, international peace and democracy will be in peril. A passionate appeal from Ukraine's ambassador to the United Nations as his country came under yet more sustained attack from Russian forces. An initial day of peace talks in Belarus has now ended, with Ukraine describing the negotiations as extremely difficult. On the ground, Ukrainian forces are continuing to put up stiff resistance, but the authorities in Kharkiv say at least 9 people had been killed and dozens injured in repeated shell attacks on residential areas. Terrified families there, as in other cities, spending another day and another night huddled in basements and shelters. And we should warn you that there are some very distressing images in my report.
This is war. The small heart getting CPR belongs to a 6-year-old girl in Mariupol. The woman looking on is her mother. The man getting taken away on a stretcher is her father. A family torn apart in their home by a Russian shell. The battle to preserve life is frantic, feverish, visceral.
Вот эти глаза вот этого ребенка и плачущих врачей, чтобы он сдох.
So, Vladimir Putin, is this what you meant by putting an end to genocide in Ukraine? Because the little girl didn't make it, and that, Mr. Putin, is on you, all of it. Here in Moscow today, painting himself as the victim of sanctions from the empire of lies, as he now calls the West. He was addressing the tight inner circle of advisors that he's reluctant to even share the same air with. Back to his handiwork. Indiscriminate Russian cluster bombs in Ukraine's second city of Kharkiv. This is the second attempt to capture this place of over 1.5 million people, and it does not involve sparing civilians. Who wants to live in a Russian world, the voice asks. The battle for Kharkiv isn't over yet. The one for the capital, Kyiv, is about to intensify. This was a column of Russian armor heading to the gates of the city. Some have already announced their arrival in the northern suburbs. Imagine the terror of being trapped in your home when war visits your neighborhood. No wonder the mood inside the capital is twitchy, triggered. This was the scene at one of the city's many roadblocks. They're afraid of the enemy within as much as the enemy outside, and there's a shoot-to-kill order against anyone suspicious. Meanwhile, Ukrainians are having to do something that they haven't done since Soviet days, when Moscow did run this place. Queue for bread, for hours. In the same region, but in a parallel universe on the Belarus border, the Ukrainians and Russians held talks today. No preconditions, but also no sign of any progress. At least they've agreed to carry on talking. And yet this was Kyiv tonight.
Well, a short time ago, I spoke to Dmitry Suzlov, an international relations specialist from Russia's Higher School of Economics, who's also a close associate with President Putin's leadership in Moscow. I asked how, given all their justifications for going into Ukraine, Russia could justify the killing of civilians.
Well, I think that the killing of innocent civilians is completely rejected by the Russian side, and the narrative which prevails in Moscow is that the civilians are killed by the Ukrainian nationalists who wants to make an impression that this is done by the Russian troops. Look, the rationale for this military operation is to transform Ukraine. Yes, initially with the use of military force, is to restore the unity of East Slavic peoples and the historical unity between Russians and Ukrainians. From this perspective, I do not see any rationale. I do not see any rationale for the destruction and for killings of civilians. You know, the only reason why Kiev has not been taken yet is that Russia does not want to inflict damage to the city. right? Whereas the Ukrainian side deployed strike missiles in the civilian areas in Kiev, thus making it impossible to destroy them with the use of missiles. Viewing from Moscow.
Dmitry, so I'm gonna just I'm sorry, I just have to ask you this. Do you, as an intelligent man, and we've spoken a lot about this, do you seriously believe that these are Ukrainian missiles inflicting damage on Ukrainian civilians? Do you actually believe that?
I have not seen the undeniable proof of Russian missiles destroying the civilian objects in Ukraine.
But Dmitry, there are Russian tanks on Ukrainian soil. There's a 17-mile column of Russian armor heading towards Kiev. There's Russian artillery, in Kharkiv. These are Russian soldiers. This is Russian equipment. What do you think they're there for?
Well, they are there, to fulfill the purposes which Vladimir Putin has formulated: demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. To put it into different words, to accomplish regime change, establish a new interim Ukrainian government, and start a slow and difficult process of the transformation of the country. In order to do this, of course, Ukrainian troops must stop resisting, whereas nationalist battalions must be completely destroyed.
But, Dmitry, the Ukrainians, to a man and a woman and a child that I've spoken to, don't want you here.
Well, why didn't Americans go home from Iraq in 2003? I'm sorry, but we are not living in paradise.
Well, it was a disaster. No one is justifying that war. Do the sins of the Americans justify the sins of the Russians committed today?
Yes, of course they do. Yes, of course they do, because great powers behave as great powers.
You tell that to the child. You tell that to that 6-year-old kid in Mariupol who's dead now.
How many
This is nonsense, Dmitry.
No, I'm sorry. How many children did die in Belgrade when it was shelled by NATO? How many children did die in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, which remains a black hole? Come on, I mean, we do not share.
Does that make it okay for you today? That's the question. Does that make it okay for you to do the same thing today?
Well, as I explained, psychologically, for me personally, it is extremely difficult to accept the whole situation, which I characterize as awful and quite difficult to imagine some time ago. But I do understand the rationale. I do understand the purposes. I accept that the price is extremely high. But, since this operation was started, I think that there is no alternative for it to be complete.
Finally, let's move on to the subject that Vladimir Putin raised at the weekend, and that of nuclear deterrence, nuclear weapons. Do you really think that this crisis, which has now become a war, could turn nuclear?
I don't think so. I'm not sure.
So why is he threatening? Why is he threatening with nuclear?
He is not threatening
deterrence?
Nuclear weapons. He is not threatening nuclear weapons. He is just strengthening nuclear deterrence.
That may very well be the case, but it sounds very alarming under the current circumstances. That's it.
No, I don't think so. Well, the Biden administration showed prudency and quite rational approach. It said very bluntly that it will not fight a war against Russia over Ukraine. NATO has said just today that there won't be a no-fly zone over Ukraine imposed by NATO because of this very reason, that a direct military conflict in Russia would result into complete annihilation of the West, simultaneously with the complete annihilation of Russia itself.
Dmitry Suslov there on a sobering note speaking to me earlier. Well, also earlier I talked to Maria Metsentseva, who's an MP for the Kharkiv area, And I began by asking her what the situation was like on the ground.
It's a nowhere safe place in Ukraine because we've been targeted from east, north, west, and south. I am coming myself from the eastern capital, so-called Kharkiv. My house is there in the city center, which was severely bombed today by the missiles multiple times. We are withstanding for 5 days already. All places from very small villages when we've been seeing locals meeting tanks with no guns or nothing, just singing the anthem.
Maria, we've seen these extraordinary pictures of resilience, both from your military but also from civilians. But are those days now numbered as Russia prepares to step up its offensive?
From what we are seeing, Putin was informed that he can take over Kiev overnight. And, we're not going to leave our cities. We're staying here.
Maria, the Russian army is encroaching on Kiev, the street battles in the middle of Kharkiv. I mean, this looks really dramatic for your country. Are you worried that Russia is now taking this to another level and that you will not be able to resist as you have done in recent days?
We're seeing this extreme support everywhere across Ukraine when people are not welcome in Russian army as they were told to they will be welcomed. The most important thing for us, and it remains something which is undone, a possibility of no-fly zone for Ukraine.
But if you want the West to enforce a no-fly zone against the Russians, that would mean war between NATO and Moscow.
I am sure it will have a very direct let's say, resistance. We've seen it on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg when it began. We hope it will continue.
But will these measures save Ukrainian lives as the Russians step up their battle and use ever greater force?
We keep calm and carry on in this way. We see that the Russian army has difficulties with their war machines and all the rest. Well, regardless the fact of what we have seen today in Kharkiv, Kharkiv has received enough weapons to withstand these severe attacks, and we did.
And that was the Ukrainian MP, Maria Mitsentseva. Well, let's go straight to our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum. Lindsay, you seem to be underground. What's going on?
Matt, I am in a car park underneath the hotel where we're staying in Dnipro. And the reason I'm here is because the siren has just gone off. Having said that, there is no shelling, there is no bombing. There does not appear to be any immediate danger. But we have been told that we must come down here. I think you probably can't see all the people there round the corner. But, parents and their children, all day long now, you see them going up and down, all these sleepy kids crying, carrying their toys and so on, all told that they must go and spend some time in the bunker, as it were. But, it's a strange thing here because this is still peaceful. It feels like an island, though the sharks are circling. And as I found out today, the people of Dnipro, they have some pride in what they're doing because they see themselves as people who can help everybody else in Ukraine because it is still peaceful here, more or less peaceful. But the sirens keep going, and that is what happened as the day started. The day dawned and the sirens sounded. The 3 bridges over the river Dnieper here still intact. No shelling here, yet. But trouble's coming in from out of town, bringing wounded soldiers to the military hospital. About 400 injured have been brought here so far, and they've lost just one.
The wounded are now arriving from almost all directions, but mostly from the east and the south, from the territory which the occupying forces are entering from Crimea.
The hospitals released pictures of wounded soldiers being treated yesterday and today. Under the Geneva Convention, they must treat enemy soldiers too. Have you seen any Russian military casualties, and what do you do with them?
As yet, they haven't come to us. But speaking as the person in charge of communication in the hospital, I have to say it's hard to imagine what would happen if they did come here. It would be very difficult to guarantee their safety, as there would be soldiers wounded by Russian bullets in the beds next to them.
Від російських куль було б дуже важко, не знаю.
Russian forces have reportedly taken the town of Berdyansk near Mariupol, but local people greeted their liberators with shouts of death to the enemies and rather ruder things about President Putin. A former British soldier who's joined the Ukrainian army and is fighting near Mariupol sent us this message today.
This is a school that the Russians have just bombed. It's about 7 kilometres off the front line. We're just taking a bit of a respite. We've just had a week of intense fighting. We've lost a couple of guys today. First day was intense. Grad, planes, SAUs, mobile artillery, AGS. The guys did really well. At one point we were just holding a forward observation point while all this was coming in, and it's chaos, to be honest.
Further east in the Donbass, the Russians have reportedly taken several villages. They've had control of 2 enclaves in the area since 2014, but in the last few days have pushed a few miles west, further into Ukraine. Back in Dnipro, volunteers were collecting clothes and other supplies for refugees fleeing here from the south and east, Dnipro still being a safe-ish haven. I met Yulia and her 14-year-old daughter, Oleana.
We should win.
Can you win?
I think yes. I think we can.
Do you think so?
Yeah. We hope this all world to help us, and we should. Thank you. We should work.
You should get on with your work. Yeah. Someone's even had time to reproduce a meme saying, "F the Russians." Maybe one day this will be a souvenir rather than an act of defiance. On a square in the centre of town, we noticed piles of luggage and several groups of young people waiting for a bus to the border. This lot keen to show they're from India. So how long have you been studying here in Dnipro?
5 years.
5 years?
Yes.
5, 6 years. And what are you studying?
Medical.
So you're all medical students? And you're nearly finished?
Yes. Almost. About to finish. But only 3 months left.
What will you do now? Others were from Lebanon, having swapped a collapsing state for a war zone.
I am so depression, seriously. It's so bad. But we must suffer to get our diploma.
To get your diploma?
Yeah.
These are the waifs and strays of war, waiting for a reprieve, while the Ukrainians are just praying that they and their country will survive. You know, Matt, I was reading something very interesting today. It was a summary of an article which was supposed to be in the Russian state-controlled media today. It was about how now they had solved the Ukrainian question forever. It was a new era where Ukraine had once more been absorbed into the greater Russia and how much better everything was going to be. Now, that article was withdrawn. Somebody pressed the button to publish it rather early, and then it had to be pulled back. And I think that shows that the Russians did expect that by now they would have succeeded. Well, they haven't succeeded. It seems that their supply lines are very attenuated. It's very difficult for them to deal with things. We've been seeing stuff on Twitter just showing people throwing Molotov cocktails at Russian tanks. That doesn't win a war. But what I see here in Dnipro is this incredible patriotic spirit that has really come up. And it's so interesting because President Putin obviously thought that by doing this, he was going to crush that. And completely the opposite has happened. What we're seeing here is this sense of pride, both in Ukraine and in Dnipro. Dnipro, a place which will absorb those who are injured from elsewhere in the country and provide all of this help. So President Putin's hopes and dreams, for the moment, at least here in Dnipro, they're being dashed.